Good evening, and welcome to the first Healthy Women, Healthy World educational gathering for 2023. My name is Annie Kubiak, and I am a member of the Healthy Women, Healthy World leadership team, and I am honored to be hosting this event tonight. Before we go any further, we would like to update you on how medical teams is responding to the horrific catastrophic earthquake over the weekend in Turkey and Syria. Medical teams currently has partners on the ground ready to provide emergency aid and is currently accepting donations to fund those efforts. If that is something you're interested in, please go to the medical team's website at medicalteams.org and you can contribute. There's a link at the very top of the page. We really appreciate your support. Tonight, if you are new to our group, we are thrilled to have you with us. Welcome. If you're a Healthy Women, Healthy World veteran, welcome back. And we're thrilled to have you with us as well. Those of us engaged with Healthy Women, Healthy World are volunteers. We're committed to learning and becoming champions for women and children impacted by global health issues. We are supporters of Medical Teams International. We gather quarterly. Our second quarterly meeting this year will be an educational event similar to this. In the summer, we have a movie night, which is always a fan favorite. And then in the fall, we'll hold a fundraising event. And that money goes to support programs that serve mothers and children around the world. The other activity that we have is a book club, and I highly recommend it. It has been a phenomenal experience. It has really pushed me to read books that I probably would never have picked up. We come together virtually to discuss that once a quarter. And those meetings are on opposite months or one of the other months in the quarter that is not an educational event. This year, we have chosen to focus on one topic for the entire year. This is going to allow us to deeply explore together an issue that is impacting our world like never before. The world at the moment is experiencing staggering food shortages. Some countries are now teetering on the brink of famine. And if you are a female, you are likely to be the last to eat and the first one to go hungry. So that is why we have chosen this topic. So that what we are going to learn about this year is the global food crisis and is it sexist? We like to begin our events with a time of reflection and a prayer. We want to get to where we're centering our thoughts away from daily distractions to calm and turn our minds towards being together, sharing and learning. So at this point, I'd like to ask our spiritual chair, Peg Chamberlain, to lead us in this reflection and prayer.
Thanks, Annie. I heard about a recent sociological study that was conducted to determine what words bring the most joy to the human heart. And these words were the top words in order. I love you, I forgive you, and dinner is ready. Now, the first two I was expecting, but the third was a bit of a surprise. Although for sure when you think about it, it is equally profound. And I have no doubt that the first two words are used by both men and women alike. But I have a feeling, I have to believe that the third one is used by far more women around the world than men. As we listen in tonight on a topic of deep importance, I want us to be encouraged that we can all use the words, I love you and I forgive you, to bring joy to those around us on a daily basis. And I want us to come away from this evening with a better understanding of how we can help women around the world who are in need be able to use the words that also bring joy. Dinner is ready as much as possible. And if you would just please join me for a moment in a time of prayer, I'd like to pray for the people of Turkey and Syria. Oh, dear Heavenly Father, we are so grieved over the earthquake that happened yesterday, Lord. And I just want to lift up the Syrian people and the Turkish people, Lord. I want to ask for those that are still lost to be found, God. I want those that need warmth to find warmth. Those that need medical attention and need food and shelter, Lord, I pray that they would get it. God, I lift up those families that are hurting, so many families that have lost loved ones, God. Please give them comfort and please be with them. Lord, I pray for the leaders of Turkey and Syria, that they would have the courage and the strength to help all their people that are in need. And God, I pray for our leaders in our country, and I pray for us, that you would open our hearts and our minds, and that we would be able to see where we can help the people of Turkey and Syria, Lord. I know we're far away, God, but please place in our trajectory tomorrow, tonight, how we can help, Lord, and what we can do. And I just pray for the people of Turkey and Syria, Lord. Thank you, God. Thank you for listening, and thank you for caring. In your name, amen.
Thank you, Peg. Tonight, we are very fortunate to have three engaging, informative presenters, Jenny Stoeker, Jared Lollar, and Mastewal Bekele. They each bring different, incredible experiences, perspectives, and responses to the global food crisis. Our first speaker tonight is Jenny Stoeker. She's a former team member at Medical Teams International. She's now the Senior Program Officer with Food for the Hungry in Canada. We're asking for a little grace tonight. She was called away for work unexpectedly and is in Guatemala. So she's coming from us there. We had a few little technical glitches today, but we think everything's going to go smooth tonight. So Jenny, at this point, I would love to turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Annie, and thank you guys for having me tonight. Like Annie said, I'm in Guatemala at the moment, so I'm sitting as close as possible to the router, so hopefully we'll be okay. The last time I shared at Healthy Women, Healthy World a few years ago, I talked about a family that deeply impacted me when I was responding to the Rohingya refugee crisis in Bangladesh with medical teams. There are photos on the next slide, but Begum's family fled Myanmar and had family members killed along the way. I visited them a few times, and on my last visit, I found out that they had sold their rations in the refugee camp to pay for their son and brother's funeral. None of the women had skilled training or could read or write. The only chance they had at survival, as they saw it, was to get married. When Healthy Women, Healthy World approached me to speak tonight on the global food crisis and how it adversely affects women, I immediately thought back to Begum and her family. They had to make a decision to give up the only food they had for the month for another essential. And this decision, as we all know, is not just one that refugees face. I'm willing to bet that the majority of the people in the communities that Food for the Hungry and medical teams work in have had to ask themselves, like Begum and her family, where will my next meal come from? I find this question a bit perplexing, to be honest, since the majority of those we work with work in agriculture. In Ethiopia, for example, which we're going to be talking a lot about tonight, since we both work there, 80% of the population relies on subsistence farming, where nearly all the crops are used to maintain the farmer and their family. So why is this question, where will my next meal come from, so common? Why would people who work in agriculture be so worried about accessing food? World hunger had been on the decline for the past decade, but in 2014, it started to rise again, primarily due to conflict, climate change, and then the pandemic. Between 2019 and 2022, an additional and staggering 150 million people are now undernourished. To put that into perspective, that's half the population of the US. This puts the total number of people affected by hunger globally around 830 million, or 1 in 10 people. So this question, where will my next meal come from, is being asked more and more often. This all comes back to a term that you've probably been hearing more about lately, food security. It's a term that reached its peak usage in 1988, around the time of the Ethiopia famine, but it can be a bit of a nebulous concept. So today I want to talk about food security, what it is, how it happens, and why it seems to affect women more often than men. In order to do that, we're going to start really simple with a definition. Food security exists when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. Whew, okay, there's a lot to that definition. So we're going to unpack it in 4 common dimensions: availability, access, utilization, and stability. For food security objectives to be realized, all 4 dimensions must be fulfilled simultaneously. And keep in mind that while we talk through each of these dimensions, women are especially vulnerable to all 4. Studies have shown that when gender inequality goes up, food security goes down. So we're going to start off by talking about availability. Food availability addresses the supply side of food security and is determined by things like the level of food production. One of the big factors affecting availability today is the war in Ukraine. According to UN agencies, the war is creating a rise in cost of fuel, fertilizer, and wheat, which is exacerbating the hunger crisis and creating the potential for mass starvation across hunger hotspots in multiple nations around the world. Ukraine, considered the breadbasket of Europe, and Russia together export 29% of the world's wheat. In 2021, Ukraine was among the top 3 global exporters of wheat, corn, rapeseed, sunflower seed, and sunflower oil. Out of 55 countries with food crises, 36 depended on Ukraine and Russian support for more than 10% of their wheat exports in 2021. I'll say that again. Out of 55 countries with food crises, 36 depended on Ukrainian and Russian exports for more than 10% of their wheat imports in 2021. So that's a huge amount. Another large factor that affects availability is something that I'm sure you're all aware of: climate change. According to the World Bank, about 80% of the global population most at risk from crop failures and hunger from climate change are in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, where farmer families are disproportionately poor and vulnerable. Global warming affects weather patterns, causing heat waves, heavy rainfall, and droughts. For areas of the world that are already water constrained, climate change will continue to negatively affect, lost technical difficulties right there. Climate change will continue to negatively affect agriculture production through diminishing water supplies, increases in extreme weather events, and increased prevalence of pests and diseases. Without solutions, failing crop yields, especially in the world's most vulnerable and food insecure regions, will push more people into poverty. An estimated 43 million people in Africa alone could fall below the poverty line by 2030 as a result. But why does this disproportionately affect women? According to the UN, agriculture is the most important employment sector for women in low and lower middle income countries, which means during periods of drought and erratic rainfall, women as agricultural workers and primary procurers work hard to secure income and resources for their families. This puts added pressure on girls who often have to leave school to help their mothers manage an increased burden. So when we think about this, so the bottom line is when we think about food availability, we want to ask, is physical food available? Next, let's talk about access. An adequate supply of food at the international or even national level does not guarantee food security at the household level. Food access policy often focuses on how much money people are making, how much they're spending on food and other essentials, and the price of food in local and regional markets. So when I think of access, I think of the smallholder farmers that Food for the Hungry works with around the world. A smallholder farmer is a producer who rears livestock, raises fish, or cultivates crops on a limited scale. In some of the countries where we work, land availability for these farmers is a big issue. There's often not enough viable land for them to make a living on farming. Or based on the soil and a variety of other factors, they have to limit what they grow. This means that in order to get a variety of nutritious foods into their diets, they are reliant on what is often an irregular food supply in the market. Yet, due to their limited income, they can't afford the food that is available, and the vicious cycle continues. According to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, women farmers have significantly less access to control over and ownership of land and other productive assets compared to their male counterparts. Land is perhaps the most important economic asset, but women account for less than 15% of all landholders globally, even though they account for nearly half of the workforce. We also know, according to an Oxfam study, that food price spikes negatively affect specifically female-headed households. They suffer labor market discrimination, which confines them to informal and casual employment, as well as pay inequity. So when we think about access, we want to ask, can people get the food that they need? Utilization is commonly understood as the way the body makes the most of the nutrients in the food. So sufficient energy and nutrient intake comes from good care and feeding practices, food preparation, diversity of diet, and proper food distribution within the household. This, along with the way that the body uses food, determines an individual's nutritional status. Utilization is often linked to access, like I touched on briefly before. If you have access to food, but it's not nutritious, then food security does not exist. So this is often what people call hidden hunger, and it happens in both low and high income countries. In 2009, I had an internship in Fresno, California, or as I like to call it, Yes. Fresno is the second most food insecure city in the US, with almost a quarter of its residents unable to consistently put food on the table. Many residents live from paycheck to paycheck and at times don't have money to purchase nutritious foods. Instead, many food insecure families tend to eat the cheapest food that they can find, which is often high in calories and low in nutrition, which means in Fresno County, hidden hunger looks a lot like obesity. More than 63% of adults and 1/3 of children are obese. Now in Ethiopia, utilization looks different than it does in Fresno. Due to poor access, availability, and utilization, almost 1 in 3 children under 5 are stunted in Ethiopia. And stunting, as WHO defines it, is the impaired growth and development that children experience from poor nutrition, repeated infection, and inadequate psychosocial stimulation. So that's 1 in 3 children under 5 in Ethiopia. Children are defined as stunted if their height for age is too far off the median. And what this means is that children just aren't getting enough nutrition to develop at a healthy rate. Again, this tends to affect women and girls more. Within the household, because they have a weaker bargaining position, women frequently eat least, last, and least well. I'll say that again. They often eat least, last, and least well. When households don't have adequate funds to buy food, they typically rely on a cheaper and less diverse diet. Again, women tend to buffer impacts through extreme strategies. So they'll reduce their own food consumption to feed others. They might collect wild food, migrate or sell assets, or even take on risky jobs. So when we think about utilization, we want to ask, is the food nutritious? And finally, the last dimension that we're going to talk about is stability. So even if your food intake is adequate today, you are still considered food insecure if you have inadequate access to food on a periodic basis, which could deteriorate your nutritional status. Adverse weather conditions, political instability, or economic factors like unemployment or rising food prices may have an impact on a person's food security status. As more people globally are facing humanitarian crises than ever before, food security is at the top of our mind. Emergencies have generally become more complex and longer lasting. And these are what we call complex crises, which happen when an acute emergency, like a natural disaster, happens when there's already ongoing instability. So a very current example would be the earthquake that just hit Syria this week. But also Ethiopia has been experiencing a complex crisis. In November 2020, a violent conflict erupted in northern Ethiopia. Over the last few years, the conflict killed thousands and displaced over 5 million people. A peace agreement was signed in November 2022, but millions are still displaced and conflict continues in pockets throughout the country. And at the same time, poor rainfall during the usual October to December rainy season marked the 5th consecutive below average rainy season in the Horn of Africa. An estimated 23 million people in the Horn of Africa need food assistance due to drought, and most of them are farmers. The drought, along with the conflict, has increased the malnutrition rates and decreased stability. So when you think about stability, ask, is food intake adequate long-term? Now, it's hard to completely separate the 4 categories of food security because they are so intertwined. Each of them can cause the people we work with to ask, where will my next meal come from? In Ethiopia, a lack of availability and access is exacerbated by instability, which also contributes to utilization. And in all of these places, food security is a major issue. And I think maybe I lost you again.
I'll go ahead with Jenny's
Okay.
talk until we get her back. So if you could go to the next slide, please. A brand new study that was produced by CARE, another INGO in our line of work. Oh, she's back. Found that there's a disturbing correlation between hunger and violence against women. And back to Jenny.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, so they note that when food and water are scarce, women and girls often walk much longer distances in search of it, and particularly in conflict settings. This increases their likelihood of being assaulted or being coerced into exchanging sex for food. When there's not enough food to go around, some families take the extreme measure of marrying off their young daughters. I just want to pause here. As I was preparing this talk, there were multiple times that I just had to stop, taking time to breathe deeply and just pray. While what I've outlined today paints a bleak picture, when I stop and take time to reflect, I do still have a small flame of optimism. Food for the Hungry is working with community members to create kitchen gardens or homestead gardens in their backyard to increase access and availability to nutritious food. We're teaching climate smart agriculture to women and men as a way to improve the soil and ensure more stable production long term. We've provided additional training and seeds for widows to grow vegetables, as well as provide livestock like sheep. Medical teams is meeting people suffering from conflict at what is most likely the very worst moment in their life. They're providing medical assistance and life-saving nutrition in the midst of instability. Both of us are prioritizing women's empowerment and leadership in all that we do. My fellow panelists are going to share some examples about what food security looks like in their context, so I'm going to turn it back over to Annie to introduce them.
Thank you so much, Jenny. That was a lot of great information and so much to absorb. As a mother, you make decisions for your kids. I've never had to face those kind of decisions, those kind of hard decisions. So I would really appreciate you sharing how hard it is for these people around the world and helping us to start understanding a little bit more about what food security is. If you have questions about anything that Jenny talked about, please put them in the Q&A at the bottom, and she will be joining us later and she can answer those questions for you. Our next guests are coming live to us from Ethiopia. Jared Lollar and Mastewal Bekele are both medical team staff members in country there in Ethiopia. They'll be giving us a closer look at the crisis in Ethiopia and how medical teams is responding. We want to thank you both for getting up so early. It's like, what, 6 a.m. there?
Yeah, about 6 a.m.
We'll thank
It's good to be here, though.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We really appreciate it. So I'm going to turn it over to you and Mastewal.
Okay. Well, my name is Jared Lollar. I'm the Regional Responsive Fundraising Coordinator for medical teams in Ethiopia. So that means I kind of oversee a lot of the operations.
Good evening. My name is Mastewal Bekele. I am a nutrition coordinator at Medical Teams International Ethiopia, based at the country office. Thank you for having me tonight.
Yeah. So Ethiopia kind of sits in the highlands in East Africa, right in the middle of the Horn of Africa. There's a lot of elevation change. So you actually see a lot of diversity within the country, both sociologically as well as environmentally. So it's a very interesting place to work. Maybe we can move to the next slide. I've been in Ethiopia for about 8 years now. And I think part of the reason I've stayed so long is just because it is such a diverse and complex environment to work in. Ethiopia has more than 80 languages, about 86 languages. It's the second most populous country in Africa, with more than 113 million people. It's a very religious country. They have a lot of history. It was the first Christian nation even before the Roman Empire. And in addition to that, it also has the first mosque that's outside of Saudi Arabia, the Al-Nagash up in the north. So it has a lot of history, it really has a lot of deep culture. Ethiopia is very proud of the fact that it was never colonized. It's remained very independent. And it stretches back even to the beginning. Some of the first hominid fossils are found in Ethiopia. So there's a lot of history, there's a lot of diversity, and that also means there's a lot of complexity in the environment. So, next slide. This map shows the food insecurity estimates for 2021. So that was kind of at the height of the conflict and the height of the drought that was occurring. I won't get into too much detail, but just to say, you can see how Ethiopia, sitting in the middle of the Horn of Africa there, is one of the most severely impacted areas. But really, that map is kind of an oversimplification. Within that dark red area that shows a phase 4, or in some places phase 5 emergency, you had a lot of variation. So in some places, it's likely that you had full-blown famine. In other places, you had a phase 4 emergency. And that just means the severity of the food insecurity in those areas. But it was a very complex environment. Within that red space, you had a lot of different conflicts. You had a lot of different kinds of environments. Some of those places within that red area are food deficit producing areas in normal years. Some places are food surplus producing areas in normal years. But what you had, given the multiple emergencies that were ongoing, was that supplies, people, animals were often restricted. So you couldn't move supplies from a surplus area into a deficit area. You couldn't move people from a deficit area into a surplus area. And that kind of goes back to what Jenny was talking about, things like access, utilization. You had spiking prices in some areas. So it was a complex environment. Next slide. Jenny kind of touched on some of this, but the situation in Ethiopia, I think what we want to convey is that it was a complex emergency, like she said. The big issue was the conflict that broke out in the north between the Tigray region and the federal government. It began kind of suddenly on November 3rd, 2020. And they've only recently signed a ceasefire on November 2nd, 2022. So it lasted almost exactly 2 years. But again, peace doesn't happen overnight, even though there's a ceasefire in place. You know, there's still a lot of armed groups, and peace is a process that has to be built. So it doesn't mean that everything went back to normal on November 2nd. It's still really hard to access many areas. There's a lot of damage. You still have a lot of armed groups controlling different areas. But they're making a lot of progress. And what we're seeing, at least in the north, is peace being built slowly, but kind of step by step. But in Ethiopia, that wasn't the only conflict. You really didn't have one war, you had multiple conflicts at the same time. So even though the one in the north was very large and kind of took the media coverage, in the south and in the east of Ethiopia, you also had other ethnic conflicts. And some of those are still ongoing. Some of those have actually gotten worse in the last month. So it's not one conflict, it's multiple ongoing conflicts. On top of that, you had the worst drought in 40 years. Jenny mentioned that there had been 5 consecutive failed rainy seasons. So much of eastern Ethiopia was impacted by this drought as the conflicts were going on. And they interact in a really complicated way, where you have normal coping mechanisms that are no longer possible because of restrictions in access, because of restrictions on the market, and because of violence that's ongoing in many of these areas. You had a situation where food surplus producing areas could no longer supply food deficit areas, where pastoralists couldn't move their flocks from one area to areas where they might have saved them, and where farmers were pushed off their land or couldn't get access to seeds, to fertilizer. So it was a systematic failure in Ethiopia. Next slide. And the scale of it is actually pretty staggering. So in 2021, Ethiopia actually set the record for the most displaced people in a year from a single country. There were 5.1 million people displaced. I think the previous record was set in Syria in 2013 with about 3.5 million people displaced. So the scale of it is huge, but you don't hear very much about it. I think in Ukraine, you get live updates every day. There's a lot of media coverage. There's a lot of social media coverage. People have access to network, they have access to cell phones and internet. But in Ethiopia, it was actually a much larger conflict. There are more soldiers involved in Ethiopia in the conflict. There were more people displaced. And it was a huge area. But what we saw in Ethiopia is that there was no network, like cell phone network. People didn't have access to power, to cell phones. You didn't have any social media. You didn't have any journalism allowed into these areas, or even photography coming out of it. So it kind of happened in a black box. And even for those of us that were on the ground, you might be kind of in the middle of things, or very close to the front lines, but you might not know what's happening even a few kilometers down the road, because there's no cell phone network, there's no coverage, and the news was tightly controlled. So even though Ethiopia was a very large conflict, it's largely been out of the media, it's been forgotten, and it's been ignored. Next slide. What medical teams works on is health and nutrition in this setting. So we started with emergency response in the conflict zone. This is one of the primary healthcare centers that we work at. One of the blocks was burned, and you can see our team is working out of one of the blocks that's still there, kind of setting up a makeshift pharmacy to serve some of the people. The healthcare system in Ethiopia has been severely damaged and degraded, and it's going to take years to bring it back up to baseline. In many parts, especially rural Ethiopia, there was already a low baseline, low healthcare coverage, and poor access. So you already had a lot of insecurity when it comes to healthcare, a lot of insecurity when it comes to food. And so the violence exacerbated that. And especially in a society with a lot of gender-based violence and gender inequality kind of at that baseline under a normal setting, you see a lot of those underlying inequalities exacerbated by the conflict. Next slide. This is a picture from a primary hospital. So on the right, you can see the delivery ward. On the left, I think that used to be the card room. And this is kind of common for what you see in northern Ethiopia across the board. Many health facilities were targeted, were looted. And while there is some donor funding to address the emergency needs, for example, to provide mobile teams to go out and do treat communicable diseases, injuries, there's less donor funding and less interest in the long-term impacts and in rebuilding things, which is a problem. A lot of the funding for humanitarian effort has been pulled into Ukraine. So budgets in Ethiopia are being cut this year. You're seeing less interest from donors in funding things like rebuilding facilities, restocking facilities. And part of that is just been a protracted emergency. The conflict in the north went on for 2 years. The scale of the need was very great. The coverage of the media was very low. And so you have a lot of like donor fatigue, and there's a lot of gaps emerging. Next slide. This is actually the child of one of our staff members. This is his youngest daughter. She was born right as the federal forces were capturing a town called Shire. So I just wanted to highlight kind of the bravery of our team and what they've gone through. They were really struggling to find healthcare for the staff member's wife. There were airstrikes, there were artillery strikes. The federal forces were approaching the city, and the healthcare system had shut down. So it was very difficult to find a place to have a safe delivery. And our team was able to do that. They were really great, supporting each other, making sure that the staff member and his wife got healthcare, had a safe delivery under these kind of adverse circumstances. But that was very difficult for even one of medical team staff, where they're working with a team of doctors, where they have access to an NGO car. And a lot of women in the area just didn't have that. They weren't able to get access. And even still now, you're seeing a lot of women delivering at home in Tigray and in northern Ethiopia. So it's been a difficult situation for many people. Next slide. And I'll hand it over maybe to some questions.
Gosh, Jared, thank you so much for all of that information. For me, it's very enlightening. I feel like I know very little about Ethiopia, and appreciate all that information that you have given us. We would love to spend hours with you all, and we know that you don't have that kind of time, but we have formulated some questions that we would like to ask you and Mastewal, and maybe learn a little bit more about what's going on in Ethiopia. So the first question I think is for you, Jared, is what did it feel like trying to bring health and wholeness in a war zone? And did you see women suffering in different ways than their male counterparts while under siege?
Yeah, definitely there's a disparity in the way that conflict impacts men and women. And it's really terrible for everyone across the board. But some of the research that I was reading recently estimated that for every one case of mortality due to combat or due to direct violence in modern warfare, there are 5 cases of mortality due to indirect impacts. So that means like the spread of disease, loss of healthcare, especially nutritional impacts. So that's a huge disparity. People think of the direct impact of violence, of combat, modern weapons, but really the most significant cause of morbidity and mortality in modern warfare is just the fact that people can't go to the hospital anymore. They can't deliver in a safe facility. And especially nutrition drives a lot of that mortality and morbidity. And nutrition primarily impacts women and children under 5. You almost never see a healthy, otherwise healthy adult male suffering from acute malnutrition. It's very rare, and usually there's an underlying condition or problem that feeds into that if you do see it. The first people to be impacted by a lack of nutritional access are always very small children, and especially pregnant and lactating women. And that's because they, when a woman's pregnant, when they're lactating, they have much higher metabolic needs, but then also younger children are relying on them. So you have this interaction, which makes them very vulnerable to nutritional shocks. But as Jenny talked about, on top of that, you have an underlying inequality. Women are the last to eat. They often eat the least. They're the first to go hungry. And so you have this interaction, especially when there's a complex emergency, and regular coping mechanisms break down. People aren't able to find other work. They're not able to move to areas where there might be better markets. Markets start to break down. You run out of items. Especially in the North, what we saw was that because different parts of the country were cut off from one another, very quickly you saw things start disappearing from the market. Maybe things that were grown locally would last longer, but things that were transported from another area or grown in another area quickly disappeared. So that meant that prices increased dramatically, but also that people just had a hard time finding things in the market to eat. They ran out of things that were manufactured, like oil, and those became very scarce. So it was a difficult situation, especially for the most vulnerable people.
I would imagine too that mostly the men were the fighting. So I would assume there's a lot of women then that lost their husbands. So that would have to change economically too, how their household ran. Is that part of the issue?
Yeah, very much. And especially in Ethiopia over the last 2 years, according to Human Rights Watch and a couple of other, there was a joint investigation team. There was a lot of systematic violence against women, a lot of systematic gender-based violence, and women were often targeted for violence by different armed factions. So it was a very difficult situation, especially in the rural areas. Women were very vulnerable and lost access to their households, to their land, to their communities, and were often targeted by armed groups. So it was a very difficult situation for many women to deal with, especially when you have displacement of populations on that scale, when so many women and children across the North were displaced and had to flee their homes, and made them especially vulnerable.
When you talked about, like most of the men, you don't see too many now malnutrition. I can't say that word. Men. Last fall at our luncheon, Cheryl Boudon spoke, and she is the author of Half the Sky, which she wrote with her husband, Nicholas Kristof. And in that book, they talk about the same thing, where men are going to get the food first in a family, and then, the women and children last. So is that a cultural thing? I mean, is that, I mean, not just Ethiopia, but that's kind of a cultural, different parts of the world.
Yeah, you see that in many places. I mean, maybe Mastewal can speak more to that. but you do see it very commonly.
Okay. Going on to you, Mastewal, can you tell us about some of the programming targeting women in Ethiopia, and maybe how medical teams is working to empower women?
Yeah, thank you, Annie. Medical teams has been so flexible and pragmatic in terms of addressing the needs of people served, specifically women. The overall programming has been drilled through the needs and priorities of communities. Jenny mentioned it earlier that women are vulnerable on all dimensions of food security, such as availability, access, utilization, and stability. Women suffer the most from macro and micronutrient deficiencies, especially during reproductive years. So moreover, this results in a long-term negative development impact for the entire society beyond the women. In terms of crisis, generally poor households face asset loss and lower income, but still men usually have a means or a pathway out of the crisis, whereas women often face severe time burdens given their household role because of the social norm and the culture. As they usually have a weak bargaining position with regard to household income, they frequently must reduce spending on nutrition and family well-being, as well as spending on themselves. And social norms and patriarchal roles within the society further complicate the issue, making women the last to eat and the first to go hungry, especially in time of crisis. So medical teams acknowledge this need and prioritize women in its programming. To support this with figures, last year in 2022, 74% of our beneficiaries, that is around 7 out of 10 beneficiaries were women. And this year in 2023, Medical Teams International aim to reach more than 70% of women in its programming. Over to you.
We have heard about how courageous your staff and people of Ethiopia has been through this conflict and growing food crisis. Can you share with us, Mastewal, maybe a particular story of courage and resilience that comes to mind?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Annie. Medical Teams International has, as an organization, have 5 values, and one of the values is being courageous. Actually, it is the first value. And this value illustrates the fact that we are bold and we know it takes bravery to break down the barriers and do what we do. So as we serve the people in need under complex situations, including war and siege, our staff also often demonstrates this core value, being courageous in their day-to-day activities. So the particular story that come to my mind is the story of using donkey cart. So here is the story. While providing service to thousands of internally displaced people in Ethiopia's Tigray region during the time of the active war, there was a time when there was no access to fuel due to blockade. As a result, all our vehicles ran out of gasoline, and our staff were not able to transport medical supplies and ready-to-use therapeutic foods to the camps where thousands of malnourished pregnant and lactating women as well as children were living. So our staff realized that those women and children that are kept at the middle of the violent war do not have any other means to survive. And this is when our staff considered one of the traditional means of transportation, which is loading the therapeutic food using donkey to transport it to the camp. And they were able to save lives of women and children in need. They were able to accomplish their goal and save many lives by being courageous and also innovative at the same time. So this is one of the many stories that come to my mind. Thank you.
That's a great story. That kind of makes me wonder, though, like looking at those pictures that you shared of all the damage. You know, it's my understanding your work is continuing. It didn't stop because of the war. So how did you, like the donkey cart story, how did you also adapt to losing facilities, but still continue to serve people?
Yeah, that's also an interesting question. Medical International as an organization have 3 approaches of intervention. The first one is direct service. We usually adopt this direct service whenever we don't have a static facility functional. So we were using mobile teams, a comprehensive team with different specialties to support those people in need, especially whenever they are displaced from their hometown and they are residing in any camp where there is no other facility. And also whenever the host communities are not having access to a functional facility, we activate our direct service approach, where we will be sending a specialized mobile team with all the equipment and supporting the people in need there. Yeah.
Just one more follow-up on that, but you mentioned earlier how many different languages that are in that country. Using mobile teams, is that an issue? Do you go from place to, finding translators and things like that?
Yeah, usually it doesn't mean we will be deploying those mobile teams from the center of the country or from the country office. We might try to recruit them from similar areas which are stable, so that we can have someone speaking the local language. And sometimes, if the worst come, we also hire incentives who can do translation. So we really make sure that we are hearing the needs of the people we serve, and we make sure that we are also being accessible, and we are also being respectful of the culture and the norm there. And also we are always making sure that the beneficiaries are understanding what we are educating them and what we are serving them.
Okay, thank you. Let me see here. We've heard that 60% of the food insecure people around the world are female. Have you found that to be true in the places you serve there in Ethiopia?
Yeah, I think definitely we found that. Most of the people we serve are women, and most of the acute malnutrition cases that we have are women. I think Jenny did a good job of covering that, why that is. You just have an underlying vulnerability that then is exacerbated by violence and exacerbated by things like conflict. And when you have multiple emergencies interacting with one another, those are the populations that are most vulnerable. It's women and children under 5 that are the first impacted and the hardest impacted. And I think that's what we see in all of our sites. We also work a lot with the UNFPA, doing sexual reproductive health in many areas, because that is a huge driver of mortality. The loss of clean and safe deliveries, when women have to start delivering at home or don't have access to things like cesarean sections. And then when they don't have access to proper nutrition, these are some of the biggest drivers of mortality. And they definitely impact women and children first and hardest.
On that line, can you tell us some of the programming that medical teams house there targeting women?
Yeah, women are much more likely to come to the clinic anyways. They're often the ones that have to bring children, and they're more likely to kind of interact with us from the beginning. But also we do a lot of like targeted interventions. We provide psychosocial support for people that come to the clinic, so counseling, and often that involves counseling for gender-based violence, counseling for cases of rape. We provide clinical management of rape in our clinics, as well as referrals to different facilities. We do a lot of work with antenatal care and with strengthening the maternity wards in some hospitals around where we work. So that kind of like from the primary care to the hospital care, we've strengthened the system, trying to make sure that women, especially vulnerable women who have been displaced, have access to things like, antenatal care, clean deliveries, and this sort of thing. But also just targeting women and children with nutrition screening and nutrition care, and making sure that we involve them in the care. Whenever we go into a new area, so for example, if we have new displacement in a certain area and we want to send one of our mobile health teams, we'll do an assessment, and that assessment usually includes interviewing key informants like women, to make sure that we get their input on things. What are the things they're concerned about? What is the situation that they're facing? What do they have access to and not have access to? And that's something you really have to hear from women on the ground, because sometimes you'll hear a different story from community leaders or from government officials. It's good to go and involve people who are being impacted on the ground. So we try to do that.
Yeah.
Is that how you, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just want to, is that how you get the word out so people know that medical teams is there to help them? Is that just a kind of word of mouth traveling?
That's usually part of the assessment. So when we do an assessment, we try to involve local community members and especially women to get their needs and input on needs. But when we're often trying to deal with the most acute emergency needs. So usually our health team is the only available healthcare in the area, which is something by design. We don't want to duplicate services with other organizations, with the government. So we're usually targeting areas where there's nothing else available. And so it's the word spreads very quickly within the community that we're there and that we're providing service. That health center that was in the picture, I think the day we took that picture, we saw more than 300 consultations.
In that damage.
Yeah, and that was, I think, the first day that we went back there, because the fighting was very intense there for a couple of weeks, for about a month. So it was inaccessible during that time. You couldn't bring a team there. So it had been something like more than a month, almost 2 months since that town had any access to healthcare of any kind. And that first day, without getting the word out to anyone, I think 300 people showed up for care. So there's a huge need. There's a huge emergency need, an acute need, but also there's a chronic need. It's going to take years to build a lot of these things back up to baseline. And that's kind of the point that we're getting to. We're starting to face that period where now it's time to rebuild things. Now it's time to restock clinics. And there's just not as much interest in that. And it's a difficult sell. Yeah.
And you say not as much interest as, you mean outside of Ethiopia? I mean, do people in Ethiopia themselves try to, want to be part of rebuilding?
Yeah. The local people are very motivated. Our team, we try to hire local people, like Mastewal said, who speak the local language, who are invested in the communities, and it's been amazing, their dedication. We were really only able to succeed and to continue to offer services in these difficult times because we had really dedicated local staff who were willing to put themselves at risk, who were willing to work long hours, and really cared about providing service to their communities. And that was really rewarding to work with those people and to see how dedicated they are. But there's huge challenges. A lot of the funding for emergency interventions and for the subsequent long-term development work comes from the EU or the US government. There's less interest in Ethiopia. A lot of the money has been shifted to Ukraine because that's kind of a conflict that's right on Europe's doorstep. There's not as much, I guess they don't have as much invested interest sunk into Ethiopia. It's kind of an internal conflict, a civil conflict that happens in an area without much US or EU investment or interest. And on top of that, there's just not as much money on the table next year for interventions in general. I think the pot globally is shrunk, even while the needs in Ethiopia remain very intense. Yeah.
Mastewal, did you want to add something? I think I might have stepped over you a minute ago.
I think I'll talk on the slide, which was just displayed with one of our beneficiaries, a mother and a child. Last year in Tigray, as many as 30% of children and 55% of pregnant and lactating women were acutely malnourished. Just to simplify this figure a bit, it's equivalent to 3 out of 10 screened children being malnourished, and also more than half of the pregnant and lactating women being malnourished. So the photo you see on the right of the slide is a photo of one of our beneficiaries in Ethiopia, Tigray, named Winta. Winta is a 35-year-old woman who used to work in the government office. She didn't get her salary for nearly 2 years since the conflict broke out back in November 2020, and she didn't have another means of income. So she usually was stressed because she was not able to feed her children, as she has no any food item to prepare at home. And while she's under this condition, her 7-month-old child named Kiana, who she's carrying in this photo, got malnourished and sick. At the time, they don't have money to get a meal, let alone paying for treatment. So Winta brought Kiana to medical team's mobile health and nutrition treatment clinic with symptoms of fever and cough. So our medical doctor assessed the child and prescribed medication for her illness free of any charge. When Kiana was also assessed for her nutritional status, her mid-upper arm circumference measurement, it's a measurement we use to identify malnutrition, was 8.5 centimeter, which means she is severely malnourished. So Kiani was enrolled in outpatient therapeutic program within the medical team's mobile health and nutrition team clinic. And our team also put together a feeding program with locally available items to help Kiani to achieve better treatment outcomes quickly. And fortunately, after 4 weeks of enrollment, Kiani was able to make a recovery. And Winta was also linked to general food distribution program, where she can receive wheat, oil, and other food items so that she can support herself and her family. So just to talk of the big picture as a country, in Ethiopia, 80% of the population resides in rural areas, and women provide the majority of the agricultural labor in the community. However, their contribution often go largely unrecognized, and their fathers, husbands, or their male family members restrict their access to resource and community participation. Worse, 1 in 3 women experience physical, emotional, or sexual violence, and 65% of women have experienced female genital mutilation, one of the harmful practices common in Ethiopia. And only half of girls who enroll in the primary school ever make it to grade 5. So there is a high level of school dropout for women. This situation gets more horrible for women in time of crisis, like conflict, war, and droughts. So this will make the women and girls more vulnerable, and women in time of crisis are the first to go hungry and sick, and which is why more than half of the women screened for malnutrition or nutritional status are getting malnourished. Women are also being challenged with stress and other mental health problems due to the aforementioned struggles they are facing every day. And the story of Minta I shared earlier is one big example to support this. So there needs to be a lot of support to empower women in Ethiopia. And there needs to be a lot of support in terms of increasing their access to health and wellness to support them better deal with those challenges that I mentioned. Thank you.
Actually, do you mind if I say something about Winta?
Sure.
But part of the story is that while we were treating her for about 4 weeks, nobody could find nutrition supplies in this region. So in this area where she was, it was cut off from the rest of the country, and the roads were cut off by the fighting, and it was impossible to transport things like therapeutic food or medicine, or all of these things we had shortages of. Diesel and gasoline, everyone ran out, not just MTI, but like every organization ran out of these supplies. And it was very dangerous for a lot of the patients. You know, we had a bunch of severely acutely malnourished children that were undergoing treatment, and then suddenly we were cut off. We didn't have any therapeutic food to give them, which is a huge risk factor. It's something that can very easily contribute to high rates of mortality, because these are very vulnerable children. And if you interrupt the therapeutic feeding, suddenly they can very quickly kind of slide back, very quickly lose weight, and die. And you can't just feed them anything. They have very specific nutritional needs. Like it's very difficult once your body gets to that point, and it's severely malnourished. It needs a special balance of vitamins, of oils, of minerals, to start gaining weight again. So you can't just eat anything. It's very specific. It's not just food, it's like medicine that you have to give. So at that time, our team was really scrambling. And we were really lucky to have really good local staff who took it seriously and who took it personally. And they were scrambling to find locally available ingredients that they could use to substitute some of the therapeutic food, at least as like a short-term solution until we could transport more of the medically enriched food. So they were going to the market, they were doing assessments, they were doing things like buying eggs and figuring out how to make an enriched porridge that could act as a substitute. And so for about 4 weeks, Winta's child was treated for about 4 weeks with the regular treatment, and that's what was successful eventually. But for a period of 4 weeks before that, the team was just trying to feed her and her child with enriched porridge and teaching her how to make that and giving her the ingredients. So we were really lucky to, yeah, well, we were providing the ingredients because things like eggs became prohibitively expensive. Things with protein, oil went up something, I can't remember, it was like 500% jumped up in price. And oil is one of those things that's very energy dense. So you need like oil, and you need a protein source, and then you need a vitamin. And so these are the things that are most expensive in the market. So, I mean, really, we were lucky to have a dedicated team that really did a lot of problem solving, a lot of legwork to make sure that despite the interruptions, that these children still receive some kind of treatment just to keep them, keep them from sliding back, keep them from losing more weight, while we were trying to figure out how to get more nutrition supplies.
How can, once you treat a child that's malnourished, can you overcome whatever damage, is there a period of time, how long you have to be now malnourished till there are things that your body can't recover from?
Mastewal, maybe you know the specifics. Yeah. You're kind of the expert. There are often permanent impacts, like permanent stunting throughout life, but I'm not sure what the cutoff is.
Usually the first 1,000 days, we are counting starting from conception. The first 1,000 days starting from conception are the critical periods. That's why we are also focusing on children below 24 months to support and to provide the nutrition programming. So the first 1,000 days are very critical. And once the damage happens on this window, it's irreversible. So we are usually targeting children under 5, but more critically, the first 1,000 days are very critical, and the damage happening at that time will likely be permanent. And we call it usually stunting because it will have cognitive impact as well.
Okay. Thank you for that information. There's so much in those stories. And one of the things we touched on, or what you said, Jared, was that the people in Ethiopia are want to be involved, and you see the resourcefulness, but then I also look at the Winta that you told the story, who worked for 2 years without pay. I mean, that's dedication to the country. You know, I can't imagine too many people doing that. Which kind of maybe what other things that you want us to know about Ethiopia? I know they've, you know, terrible drought, ongoing violence. Is there anything else you'd wish to share or let us know about the people of Ethiopia today or their situation?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good thing to highlight. All of the healthcare workers in the North were working without salaries for 2 years. Nobody got any salary. It was only NGOs, and not even every NGO, that was able to transport some cash to pay people. But most of the governmental employees were working without any salary. So you see a lot of dedication. It's really inspiring. Ethiopia has this reputation for malnutrition, for hunger, I think especially since the 80s. It has kind of this reputation. But people are really dedicated, and Ethiopia was making a ton of progress for several decades. Ethiopia had really strong resilience programs. Ethiopia had some of the strongest drought and food security monitoring systems in Africa, and it was really making a lot of progress. But like Jenny talked about, it was the complexity of the emergency that set it back, and it was the fact that you didn't just have drought, you didn't just have conflict. You had multiple conflicts, you had multiple economic declines in different areas, and you had drought that were interacting with each other in a complex way, which overwhelmed the system and undid a lot of that great progress that's been made over the last couple decades. And people, I mean, people have been so dedicated and they work so hard. It's kind of tragic to see. Because you did have a lot of expertise in this in the country, and you did have a lot of really good programs.
Thank you so much for sharing all that. It's definitely been enlightening to me, and I know all of the people here. Those are the end of the questions that we have kind of already that you know about. But I know Rachel, another staff member here at Medical Teams, is going to ask some questions that our audience who has been listening tonight. And I believe Jenny is going to join us for this part as well. So Rachel, do we have some questions from our audience?
Yeah, I know we're getting short on time, but we have some great questions here. I think maybe Jenny, you might want to take this one. From Peg, can you expand on the role of stability and food insecurity? How are NGOs working to create access to food sources during the conflict that you've seen?
Sure. Yeah. And again, I think this would be a great question for Mastewal and Jared to speak to as well. You know, Food for the Hungry is also working in Ethiopia, doing some similar response, but we are also more of a development organization than Medical Teams is. And so I think when I read this question, my immediate thought was, what's the intersection? And that would be disaster risk reduction. And so something I know that Medical Teams is looking at, and also Food for the Hungry is looking at as a development organization, is sort of where do those two things overlap? And so in the midst of a crisis, you know, to some extent it's a Band-Aid. You're trying to get food in. Like Jared said, it was difficult to find the nutritious food that was needed at the time. And so that's really provided often by the UN or by other NGOs. And it's not incredibly sustainable, right, when you're in the midst of an emergency. But as, you know, that emergency either drags on or dies down a bit, then you have a chance to sort of implement some disaster risk reduction techniques in the midst and move on more towards sustainable development. So whether that is training farmers on climate smart agriculture or ensuring that people are maybe not living on a hill where we think a mudslide is going to happen, just those little pieces that I think make a big difference. So that's what I would say.
Rachel, do we have any more questions?
Sure. This one, there's a couple about our Ethiopian staff. The audience is wondering how big of a presence do we have in Ethiopia and the size of the staff?
Yeah, I think I can answer that. We've actually grown really quickly. I think we were registered in June of 2021 in Ethiopia. And since then, I think we're now the second biggest MTI country program. Maybe somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but at least in terms of funding. So it's grown very quickly. Since I've been with MTI in Ethiopia, I think we've gone from like 20 staff to now more than 150, 160. And we're working in 3 different regions. Really MTI was able to be really flexible, and we've been really appreciative of that, which has allowed us to reach a lot of areas that were difficult to reach and to be the first on the ground in some areas, and that's allowed us to grow really quickly. But on top of that, we just had a good group of national staff that we really built our foundation on, who were really dedicated. It was those staff who were, scrambling to find solutions for winter. That's really the foundation that we built on in Ethiopia. So we've grown very quickly, and we're still growing very quickly. I think Mastewal has taken our nutrition program from 0 to 100 in just 5 months. And on Monday, she, I think, got notification that we've got our first UNICEF WFP grants.
Awesome.
So it's a big step, and we're really proud of what we've achieved in a very short amount of time. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
Do we have time for any more, Rachel?
Maybe we could do 1 or 2. and then
Okay.
wrap up. Cindy would like to know, with the degradation of the healthcare system in Tigray, are you seeing an increase in obstetrical fistula or other childbirth injuries?
Yeah, it's actually, especially now in many areas, because primary healthcare isn't functional still in some areas, and hospitals still aren't accessible. In a lot of areas, you still have like curfews. There's no public transportation. So the biggest thing is we just don't have any idea how many women are delivering at home. So we're not even sure of the scale of the problem. But I think it's safe to say that maternal mortality has increased dramatically. But if women aren't coming to primary healthcare, if they're not coming to the hospital to deliver, I don't think we have any idea what the actual increase is or how many fistulas or childbirth injuries we're seeing. But our team has had to deal with some very difficult cases where you have women with obstructed labor or women with complicated labor coming to a mobile clinic, in a facility like the one that we showed you, maybe where part of it's burned, some of it's looted. You have this very complicated case that comes, and there's no way that you can deal with it. There's no operating theater, transport is shut down. You have a curfew, so you can't even transport them to the hospital in time. The hospitals weren't offering 24/7 service for a long time. And even now it's very limited. So it's a huge problem. And nobody's sure quite how big it is in the north.
Thanks, Jared. We've had a couple of questions about how long you think medical teams will be in Ethiopia. And we know that often it's until there's stability and we can transfer to a local partner, or as long as the funding lasts and we can, the desire is to transfer it to keep the work going. Do you have any comments on that beyond that?
Yeah. So the way that we work in Ethiopia is we try to come in and address the emergency need, usually with a mobile health team. So like a little mobile clinic that we move around. We come in, we address like the most acute emergency needs. And then while we're doing that, we try to build up the rest of the healthcare. So we do a lot of health system strengthening. So that often means like bringing government employees back to the health center. A lot of the time they fled the violence, so they've left their posts, they left the job, they've gone somewhere else. So we will pay like incentives to bring them back. We'll restock the health center with medicine and equipment. We'll try to do like minor repairs, rehabilitation. So while the mobile team is dealing with the most acute emergency needs, we'll try to rebuild the system so that we can leave, and then we'll support the system until it's back up to baseline. It doesn't always work that way. We have a lot of like ups and downs. You have facilities that have been looted and damaged multiple times in the conflict, so we've rebuilt them. And then there's another round of violence. So we have to go back with the mobile team and kind of start over. But things are improving in the north. And actually, one of the things that Mastewal and I were doing just a week ago, 2 weeks ago, is we were doing more assessments of the refugee camps in Afar, in regions like Afar, Somali, and in Amhara. So we're hoping over the next year that we can move away from the emergency needs, move into projects that are more like health system strengthening, rebuilding the system, handing the system back over to like local government stakeholders. And we're also looking at more refugee programs. So those are longer term programs. Ethiopia, I can't remember the exact numbers, but Ethiopia has a huge amount of refugees.
At the second largest number of refugees in Africa. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, and that's part of that goes back into the global crisis. I think the UNHCR, the UN organization that handles refugee programs, their funding in Ethiopia has been cut by something like 50% next year. So they're really looking for partners like MTI, and we're actually working with FH in one consortium on a refugee camp. They're really looking for partners that can help fill the gaps. And there's a lot of desperate need, and those are longer term projects. So we're seeing how we'll move into those and how we can fill some of those gaps in those responses. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We're just going to wrap up with one last question, and Jenny, maybe you can take it first, and then Jared and Mastewal, if you have any additions. Kathleen wants to know, she appreciates the comments regarding the difference between news coverage of the Ethiopian crisis and what's happening in Ukraine. Do you guys have any suggestions on how we receive our international news and how we can be conscientious consumers of news?
Yeah, definitely. I can give some suggestions for news sites that I like. I'm a little podcast crazy, so I think the BBC does a really good global news podcast every day. It's just 15 minutes and they release it twice a day. And they're pretty good at covering what's happening across the world. There's also some BBC focused podcasts that are just BBC Africa that I would recommend if you're interested in that. So those are some tangible ways, but I think the first step is really just recognizing that the news we receive is bias, and the next step is really figuring out what that looks like and what that means. So that would be my thought. But Jared or Mastewal, over to you guys.
Yeah, that's a good one, Jenny. And just to add more, for someone who's more interested on humanitarian emergencies, they can subscribe to Medical Teams International's website. We always flag those emergencies as soon as they happen. And we also show the coverage, the response level, and the gaps. So whoever is interested on this kind of uncovered humanitarian emergencies, which we don't usually get on the global news, they can subscribe to Medical Teams International's website. We have a range of websites on LinkedIn, Facebook. We are on every social media, so they can subscribe and they can get notification as soon as the updates are released. Yeah, thank you.
I think my only advice is just try to get a diversity of sources. I think what I've learned in Ethiopia over the last couple of years is that it's very complicated, and that you never get a single source or single story or a single person that's unbiased. And the more you spread out and the more you're willing to explore from different sites, listening to different people, the better off you are. You learn the most from people who are different from you. And if you want accurate news, you have to look at a lot of different sources, because you'll never get one that has everything. Yeah.
Thank you. Those are all phenomenal suggestions. We really appreciate that. And we just can't thank you all enough for being with us tonight. I know we've kept you a long time, and I know some of you still have the workday ahead of you. We just appreciate you sharing your time and expertise as we're starting to learn more about this crucial topic. And we, again, thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
We have just a couple cleanup items here tonight. Just as that last question highlighted, we're starting to learn about this. And one of the things, you know, Healthy Women, Healthy World want to do is to challenge you to learn more. Al Jazeera was another news site that we were going to recommend. And again, like I said, this podcast is recorded, so you can probably come back and write some of these down. But we'll also put some of these on the Healthy Women, Healthy World site on Facebook. But as they've mentioned, Jared mentioned, you know, the funding is down because the focus is not on Ethiopia. The focus is on what we see in our mainstream media, likely Ukraine. So we want you to learn, as I said, multiple sources, and also share that so other people know that there is a crisis out there, and share this information on your social media platforms. The more people we can get to engage and learn about these problems, hopefully the more funding we can get and have some solutions. So thank you all for being part of this tonight. I do want to let you know, let's see, we got a couple things to let you know. We have our next virtual book club meeting on Zoom on April 19th. And this quarter, we are reading the national bestseller, Cutting for Stone by Abraham Verghese. The recap for this is it's an unforgettable coming-of-age story set in Ethiopia as the country hovers on the brink of revolution. And again, I highly recommend you kind of expanding your horizons by some of these books. In May, we will have a second educational event similar to this evening. In the summer, we have a movie. It's not been chosen yet, but as soon as we know, we'll let you know. And that event, one will be held in Seattle and one will be held in Portland. And then, of course, in the fall, we will have our fundraising event where we can come together, again, continuing to learn, but also supporting medical teams program with our fundraising. So please watch for this follow-up email that will be coming soon, and you will continue to get information about programs and the link that this site that you can share it. And I do believe there's a screen that has a QR code. So we do have a Healthy Women, Healthy World Facebook page. And so you can scan that QR code and join. We share not only information about what else is going on with the with our group, but also we will post information that we find on some of these, again, websites that and news outlets that have been suggested this evening. So I believe that is all I have for you. I know we've kept you a little bit longer tonight than we anticipated, but we just such great information. We hope that you enjoyed being with us. Again, we would love for your feedback if you have time to fill out the survey, because we want to make this as informative and enjoyable for all of you. So we thank you so much for being with us, and we hope to see you soon at our next event. Thank you.